The year she turned 30, she was sold for cattle. A Lakota chief returned every head. I want to tell you about the cattle first. Not because the cattle matter, they don't, not anymore, not one of them, but because that's where this whole thing started, and if I begin somewhere else you won't understand why I did what I did, or what it cost me to do it, or what it gave back that I never thought to get. 31 head of spotted longhorn. That was the price her father set. 31 head, 2 good horses, and a bolt of red wool cloth that came off a trader's wagon out of Cheyenne. I know the number because I sat across the fire from old Lakota the night he named it, and I counted the stones on the ground between my knees while he talked, just to keep my face still. He was drunk on the trader's whiskey, which was a bad sign, and his eyes had that far-off glaze of a man who has already spent the thing he's selling. The woman's name was Winona. I didn't know her then, not really. I'd seen her twice, once at a trade gathering on the flat ground south of the river, carrying water for her mother, and once the following spring when a sickness moved through the camp and I came with 2 other men to offer what medicine we had. Both times she looked at me the way people look at weather, not afraid, just measuring. She was 30 years old, which in the reckoning of some men made her close to used up, not in mine, but I was not the man doing the reckoning. The man who bought her was named Hollister. He ran a cattle operation 30 miles east, near a creek that dried up every August and ran muddy the other 10 months. He wasn't cruel in the way men who beat their horses are cruel. He was the other kind, the kind that doesn't see a thing clearly enough to be cruel or kind to it. She was an arrangement to him, a solution to a problem he had about laundry and cooking and the silence in his house. He paid the 31 head without blinking, which told me he'd come prepared, which told me he'd been thinking about this for a while, which made my stomach feel like I'd swallowed river gravel. I left that fire and rode home, and I didn't sleep. I want to be honest with you. I told myself it wasn't my business. I said that to myself 3 or 4 times, the way you repeat a thing when you already know it's wrong. The Lakota and the white ranchers had an arrangement in those years, a cautious, unhappy peace built on distance and mutual suspicion, and one man walking into that arrangement to undo a trade between a Lakota man and a white man was going to cause trouble that landed on more people than just me. I told myself that. Then I thought about those eyes, measuring the weather. I spent a week finding the cattle. Not buying them, I want to be clear about that. I did not go to Hollister and offer him money. A man like Hollister, you go to him hat in hand. You confirm something in his mind about how the world is ordered. I went a different direction. I found 31 spotted longhorns on the open range over the course of 6 days, with 2 younger men from my band who owed me favors and didn't ask questions. We pushed them north and east, away from Hollister's land, into a draw I knew where grass grew thick even in dry years. The 2 horses I replaced out of my own string. One of them I'd had for 4 years and didn't like giving up, a dun with a bad habit of biting that had never once bitten me. But I gave him up. And the red wool cloth I found at the same trader's wagon in Cheyenne, which cost me 3 good beaver pelts I'd been saving for something else. Then I rode to Lakota's fire. It was morning. His wife was outside working at something. She looked up and looked away without speaking, which told me she knew why I was there, which told me there were things happening in that camp that I didn't fully understand. Lakota came out squinting. He'd been drinking again, or he was still drinking from the night before, it was hard to tell. He was a tall man gone soft in the middle, and he had a way of standing that made you think he was about to fall. I told him I was returning the cattle, the horses, and the cloth. I told him I was taking Winona back to her family's camp. I did not ask him anything. I stated it the way you state a fact about the ground or the sky. He stared at me for a long time. He said something I won't repeat here, something about a man minding his own ground, and his voice had that particular ugliness that comes out of men when they feel caught and can't figure how to run. I didn't answer what he said. I told him the cattle were in the draw south of the cottonwood stand, that the horses were tied outside, and that the cloth was rolled in oilskin on my saddle. I told him I was going to ride to Hollister's place next, to explain the arrangement had changed. Then I turned my horse and I rode. I heard him say something behind me, loud, a few words. I didn't catch all of them and I let that be. Hollister was harder. I'd had dealings with him before, minor things, range questions, a couple of arguments about where water rights ended and began. He was not a small man physically or in his sense of himself. He had 3 ranch hands that I saw as I rode in, 2 of them near the barn, 1 up on the roof of the bunkhouse nailing shingles, and they all stopped what they were doing and watched me come. I told him the same thing I'd told Lakota, not an apology, not a request, a statement of fact. The arrangement was done. The cattle had been returned. Winona was not his. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at me. Then he said, quiet and flat, the way some men get when they are genuinely angry, not performing it. That's not how this works. I said, it is now. I won't pretend there wasn't a long moment there where anything could have happened. His hand was near his hip, not on the gun, near it. The 2 men by the barn hadn't moved. I've been asked since then whether I was scared. I think I was past scared. When you've made up your mind about a thing clearly enough, there's a kind of stillness that comes. Not bravery, I'm not calling it that. Just a point where you've already decided, so the fear doesn't have any new information to offer you. He looked at me a while longer. Then he looked at the oilskin roll on my saddle, the cloth. I suppose he recognized it, and something shifted in his face. Not softness, more like recalculation. He said, "You're going to make enemies doing this." I told him I had enough friends. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, or not, and then he turned and walked back toward his house, not fast. He had that pride in him that wouldn't let him hurry. His hand wasn't near the gun anymore. I rode out the same way I came in. I want to say it was clean after that. It wasn't. There was a man in the valley, a trader named Purvis who kept a store at the crossroads 12 miles south, who had his own business interests in arrangements like the one I'd just undone, and he made it known, quietly, through the usual channels of gossip and suggestion, that what I'd done was a kind of theft. The cattle, the horses. He wasn't wrong about the law as he understood it, but the law and I have never been on exactly friendly terms. There were 3 weeks where I had to be careful about which trails I rode and at what time of day. 2 of my younger men stayed close. I didn't like needing them close, but I liked the alternative less. And there was still the matter of Winona. She was at her sister's camp, 20 miles north. Her sister had married into a different band, which gave Winona a little distance from her father's territory. I hadn't spoken to her. I'd sent word through her sister's husband, a steady man named Chayton who I trusted, just to say she was free and that no one was going to enforce the old trade. The word that came back through Chayton was, she knew, and she didn't know what to make of me. I understood that. I didn't know what to make of me either. I stayed away for a month. There was work to do, there's always work, and I had enough on my hands without adding to it by riding over there to stand around awkwardly in a woman's camp. I told myself I'd done what needed doing and that was the end of it. She owed me nothing. I hadn't done it so she'd owe me something. I'd done it because it was wrong and I was the man who knew it was wrong and had the means to put it right. And if that's the whole story, then fine, that's the whole story. It wasn't the whole story. 6 weeks after I'd ridden to Hollister's place, Chayton came to find me at my winter camp. It was late October by then, cold enough that your breath made clouds, and I was working on a piece of harness leather that had split. He rode in easy and got down, and we stood outside for a while talking about nothing in particular, the winter, the grass, a horse of his that was lame, and then he said, without looking at me, that Winona had asked about me. I kept working the leather. He said she'd asked specifically, not casually, The way a person asks a question they've been holding for a while. I said, what did she want to know? He said, why you did it. I thought about that for a moment. I said, what did you tell her? He smiled a little, just at the corners of his mouth, and said he'd told her I was the kind of man who couldn't leave a wrong alone once he saw it, and that she should make up her own mind about what that meant. I nodded. He got back on his horse. He rode about 20 yards and then turned and said, she makes good decisions, usually, about people. Then he was gone. I sat with that for 2 weeks. And then I rode north. I want to describe this right, because I've gotten it wrong in my own head a few times over the years, sentimentalized it or hardened it depending on my mood. The truth is simpler. I rode into the camp and Chayton's wife, a woman named Hyxilla who had eyes that missed nothing, came out and looked at me without surprise and said she'd tell Winona I was there. I waited outside, sitting on a log near the fire ring, watching the camp go about its business. Kids running, an older woman scraping a hide, 2 men across the camp arguing about something in low voices. Winona came out about 10 minutes later. She was wearing a dark blanket over her shoulders and her hair was loose. She stopped a few feet away and looked at me with those same measuring eyes, not afraid, calculating distance and wind speed and whether rain was coming. She said, you returned the cattle. I said yes. She said, why? I told her the same thing Chayton had apparently already told her, that I couldn't leave a wrong alone once I saw it. But saying it out loud to her face, it sounded thinner than I wanted it to. So I said the rest of it too. I told her a man who can see a wrong and has the means to fix it and does nothing anyway is a man who's already given up on himself. And I wasn't ready to give up on myself yet. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you didn't ask me. I said no. If I wanted to be bought back. No. She let that sit there between us for a minute. It was cold. A wind came through the camp and moved the smoke from the fire sideways. Then she said very flat, I didn't want to go back to my father's camp. I said, I know. So you just decided? Yes. She looked at me for a long time after that, the way she'd looked at me before measuring, but it was different now. Before she was measuring weather. Now she was measuring something more specific, something she needed to get right. She said, you're going to eat. It wasn't a question. She turned and went back inside. I stayed. That's the simplest way I know to say it. I stayed that day and I stayed the next day, and somewhere in the 3rd day, it was clear I wasn't leaving in any real sense. And somewhere after that it was equally clear she wasn't asking me to. I won't collapse the time on you and make it seem like a clean thing that happened all at once. It wasn't. There was a period of weeks where we were careful with each other, polite in the way of 2 people who are both trying to figure out the shape of something they haven't seen before. She had a sharp tongue when she used it, not mean, but precise. She had opinions about almost everything and stated them without apology, which I respected, because I've never had much patience for people who hedge everything into nothing. She tested me twice, I think. Not obviously, she wasn't that kind of woman, the kind who tests to watch someone squirm. But once she said something about my reputation in the valley, the things people said about me, that I was cold, that I was calculating, that I was the kind of man who made decisions the way a general does, weighing everything and feeling nothing, and she said it straight, looking at me, and waited. I thought about it. Then I told her that wasn't wrong exactly, but it also wasn't complete. I told her I felt things. I just didn't often have the luxury of acting on them. I told her that most of my life had been spent in the space between what I was supposed to be and what the world would let me be, and that wasn't cold, it was just tired. She said, that's more than you've said in 3 weeks. I said, you asked the right question. She looked at me for a moment and then she laughed a real laugh, short and surprised, And that was the first time I saw what her face did when something caught her off guard. There was something in that laugh that I held onto. I still hold on to it. The second test, if that's what it was, came later. One of Hollister's men, the one who'd been on the roof that day nailing shingles, rode through the area and stopped at a camp 2 miles south. Word got back to me. I knew the man's name, Deer. Not a bad man probably, just a hired man doing what hired men do, which is keep their employer's interests in mind. He'd been asking questions. About me, about Winona, about whether the arrangement might be revisited. I rode over there the next morning. I found Deer at the fire eating. He looked up when I came in and had the good sense not to reach for anything. I sat across from him. I accepted a cup of coffee from the man who was hosting. I drank it slowly. Then I told Deer, quietly, without heat, looking at him the whole time, that the arrangement was done and was going to stay done, and that Hollister was welcome to his spotted longhorns, which were healthy and still on good grass, and that if anyone came back to revisit this question, they were going to find me at the beginning of that conversation, and I was only going to have it once more. Deer looked at me for a moment and then he nodded, just once, a small nod. The kind that says, "I'll carry this back." He carried it back. Hollister never sent anyone again. I want to tell you what it was like at the valley that winter, because it was a particular kind of winter. One of those winters that comes maybe once every 10 years, hard and still, and so cold the river ran slow and gray under ice 2 feet thick. We stayed mostly in camp, close to fires. There were 12 people in that camp total, and we were all of us in each other's company more than we might have chosen in warmer months. Winona was good at being in close quarters with people. She had a way of moving through a shared space that didn't create friction. She wasn't loud. She wasn't aggressive about anything, but she also wasn't invisible, which is harder than it sounds. She had a presence. You knew when she was in the room and you knew when she wasn't, and in a camp that's small that matters. I am not good at being in close quarters with people. I never have been. I need quiet the way some men need whiskey. It's not a preference, it's a requirement. Winona seemed to understand this about me without me explaining it. She'd find me on the far side of the camp sometimes, just sitting, and she'd sit nearby without speaking. Not uncomfortable about it. Not trying to pull me back into company. Just present. The same way a good fire is present on a cold night. Not asking you anything. The older woman in the camp, Chayton's wife's aunt, a tiny woman named Tansaka who had survived more hard winters than anyone could reliably count, told me once, in passing, that Winona was the kind of woman who could read a man's weather. I said I thought that was true. She said, "She doesn't do it for everyone, only for the ones worth the trouble." I didn't say anything to that. Tansaka looked at me with her old flat eyes, and then she went back to her fire, and that was that. By March, when the ice started to break and the days got an hour longer, and the horses in the rope corral started to pace from restlessness rather than cold, we had settled into something. I wouldn't have known how to name it then. I'm not sure I can name it now without making it sound smaller than it was. It was the way two rivers move when they come together. For a while you can still see the line where they're separate, and then the current takes it and it's gone. There was one night I want to tell you about. Late February. The camp was quiet, everyone asleep or close to it. I'd been outside for a while, couldn't settle. One of those nights where my mind was running through territory it didn't need to be in, and Winona came out and stood beside me without a word. It was clear and bitter cold, the stars so sharp they looked cut. We stood there a long time. Then she reached out and took my hand. Not dramatically, not the way you'd reach for something you were afraid was going to leave, just reached out and took it. Her hand was small and cold, and she closed it around mine and held it, and we stood there like that for a while looking at the sky. I didn't say anything. After a while she said, quietly, not looking at me, "You gave up a good horse." I said, "He bit everyone but me." She said, "That sounds like a recommendation." I said, "For some people." I felt her smile more than I saw it. We stood there until the cold got serious about itself, and then we went inside. I have thought about that moment 1,000 times since then. There is nothing in it that would make a good story told to most people. A man and a woman standing in the cold holding hands and talking about a horse. But it is the truest picture I have of what we were to each other, and what we became, and what that meant. She was not rescued. I want to be clear about that because I know how these things get told and retold and reshaped, and I know the version that goes around. The one where the chief saved the poor woman from the bad trade and she was grateful, and that was the story. That is not the story. The story is that I saw a wrong and fixed it because I'm constitutionally unable to do otherwise. The story is that she looked at me and took my measure honestly, without flattery and without fear, and decided I was worth her time. The story is that a woman with every reason in the world to be cautious and closed chose, freely, with full information, to reach across the cold and take my hand. And that gift, which was entirely hers to give or not give, is worth more to me than anything I've done or earned or held in 60 years of living. That's the story. Spring came and we moved camp as people do when the grass comes back and the horses need new ground. By then there was no question anymore about what we were. Tansaka referred to Winona as my woman, said it once in front of a group of people matter-of-factly, and Winona didn't correct her, and neither did I. Her father sent word twice that spring. I did not respond to the first message. To the second, I sent back word that Winona's situation was settled and that Lakota's cattle were healthy and I wished him well. Winona read that reply before I sent it. She made one change. She crossed out "wish him well" and put nothing in its place. I thought that was exactly right. Hollister I saw at a trading post in June. He was there with one of his hands and I was there alone. We occupied the same space for about 30 minutes. We did not speak. When I was leaving, he looked up from what he was doing and held my eye for a moment. Then he nodded. I nodded back. In my experience, that's as close to a settlement as men like Hollister ever get, and I'll take it. The Purvis trouble dried up on its own over the course of the summer. That's how most trouble dries up if you're patient and you don't give it new water. Purvis had other arrangements to keep him busy. The valley had other gossip to chew on. My name stopped coming up at the Crossroads store, which was exactly where I wanted it to be. Chayton said to me once, toward the end of that year, that what I'd done, the cattle, the whole business, had changed how a lot of people in the valley talked about me. Not just the Lakota. The white ranchers, too. He said the story had gotten around the way stories do, and that in the telling and retelling it had become the story of a man you don't push, which was fine, but it was also the story of a man who does what he says, which is rarer, and which in his view carried further. I told him I hadn't done it for the reputation. He said, "I know, that's why it works." I've thought about that a lot over the years. There is one more thing I want to tell you, because I've been careful here to give you the facts, and I want to give you one moment that is maybe more than facts. It was late October, almost a year from the day Chayton first came to my camp and told me Winona had been asking about me. We were at the winter camp again, the same ground, same cottonwoods at the east edge. I was coming in from a ride late, the cold already finding the gaps in my coat, and from a long way off I could see the fire and the shape of the camp against the dark, and the shape of a figure near the fire that I knew. She was standing outside waiting. I don't know how long she'd been standing. The fire threw light on her, and the dark was big around her, and she was looking in the direction I was coming from, which meant she'd heard my horse before I could see her face. I rode in and dismounted, and she came forward and put both hands flat on my chest. Not urgently, not like she was holding me up, just put her hands there solid, the way you put your hands on something real. She looked at me. She said, "I was starting to wonder." I said, "It's a long ride." She said, "I know how long it is." There was something in her face right then, not fear, not relief exactly, but something in between, Something that said she'd been running her own calculations out there in the cold, and had arrived at some conclusion she wasn't going to share in full but that I was part of. The good part. She dropped her hands from my chest after a moment. She took my arm, not my hand, my whole arm, both of hers around it, and we walked back toward the fire. I'm 63 years old. I have been cold and hungry and shot at and cheated and lied to, and I have stood in places where I did not know if I would stand in any place tomorrow. I have buried people I loved, and I have ridden away from things I should have stayed for, and I have made decisions I cannot unmake and lived with all of it. I will tell you this. That woman's hands on my arm, walking me back to the fire out of the dark and the cold. That's the thing I'll carry. That's what it was.